Kamal, for being my first introduction to this beautiful country many years ago when you sat and you had a lunch at Noma all by yourself. I had just read a tiny little notice in a newspaper about this new character in Lebanon that deserved more attention. That was the headline of the story. Little tiny story. This person needs more attention. And then a few weeks later, he's in my restaurant for lunch. And back then our restaurant was not very famous. You found it somehow. And then we connected. And now I'm also so lucky to have a Lebanese employee at the restaurant, Tarek. He's been with us for the last 4 years. Soon he will go back here and participate in this food movement that's happening in your country. But my story begins in Copenhagen about 16 years ago with the restaurant. But my story with food begins many years ago, and it doesn't start in Denmark. My story with food starts in the country of Yugoslavia, where my family is based. And I used to be very ashamed of my background in Yugoslavia. The war arrived in the 90s, and we left, and we ended up in Denmark. My mother is Danish, and we stayed in Denmark from then on. And in Denmark, I was so ashamed of my background, because everybody was going to Italy and going on fancy 4-star hotels. And we were going to Macedonia, riding on a donkey. If we had to have milk, somebody had to milk the cow. I thought that was so shameful. And we just lived a different life. We lived a life that somehow reminds me of here. There used to be power cuts there too.
What was the trigger when you realized that there's nothing to be ashamed of, and that it's the perfect thing that you always wanted to do?
But that came much later, because I kept this notion in me that I was trying to hide who I was, my background. And I was a poor student in school. I left school when I was 15 in dishonor. And I ended up in catering school because things have changed now, 26 years later, but cooking used to be a thing where if you were bad in school, even if you had been to jail, you could always find a job in kitchens. And so I went into a kitchen as age 15. And my story with food really begins in that moment. It was the first week in kitchen. We were asked to cook a dish. We had to choose something. And so we read books. That was before the internet. And I was flicking through these pages of the book, thinking to myself, what is it that I like about food? I was 15, I was thinking about women. I won't have 3 wives or 15 kids, but I was 15 thinking about girls and sports. But suddenly at a certain point there was a picture of a whole roast chicken. And that was like a flick for me, a moment where I'm transported to a dusty courtyard in Macedonia. And my aunt is opening the big gate because somebody is knocking on it. And it was relatives from a different village. You didn't call each other, you just used to show up. And then we had to have meat, and she was plucking the chicken. And we were watching this chicken roasting in the fireplace with the rice underneath. And the smell of the chicken when it came to the table, the way that the sound when she cracked the thigh, and the steam. It was that moment when I was in Denmark and I cooked a chicken for this competition. And to me it was like the moment where I realized, okay, there's something here. There's something here for me. And it was the most adult moment I ever had in my life. I thought to myself, is this the moment where I'm now an adult? I have never had these thoughts before about the future, about something that really moved me. It was really, truly a moment that captivated me. But my shame about my background actually stayed with me. it wasn't something that I kept sort of pushing it into the background, not wanting to talk about it. Then, some 15 years later, Noma opens. And it was a tiny little, honestly, a shithole of a restaurant. It was. We were 7 people in the kitchen and in the front of the house. And we were going to work with local ingredients. The moment where I started to really figure out that I need to remember who I am and use that as the seed that will grow into these big trees was when we started going into nature and we were foraging. It was this new word, to forage. In the West, it's a very new thing to pick things in nature. But I had these flashback moments again to my childhood, because that was, everybody did that in Macedonia. You went to the mountains for chestnuts, for berries, for mulberries. And for me, it was the moment where the idea of my background being somewhere completely different from coming from a Muslim background, Albanian in Yugoslavia, suddenly finding myself in the Nordics, cooking food from the Nordic region in the cold climate Protestant place, those two things just completely fused. I embraced everything. I started to love the fact that I used to milk a cow, and I wanted now suddenly to get milk that was only straight from the cow. And we started to focus on ingredients that could be found 1 day, 2 days in nature, something that we had to go pick ourselves. And that was honestly the seed of all the success that we have had, is this inner confidence and inner sort of settling with yourself that you are good enough, even though that it's just milking cows and riding a donkey.
Yeah, because you finally wrote your story, and the story you're telling it to your clients every day.
We're telling, but you're not shoving in their face. It's subtle. But I will say though, one thing about Noma, of course, these are the seeds, but you don't get there alone. The main key to our success is the fact that we've been able to forge a movement in which people work together. This is the most important factor of our success, is the level of collaboration that we've had. From one cook to another, from one farmer to another. There has been, at least so far, no sense of entitlement. Does it make sense, entitlement? You know, where you find yourself with a success and you feel you own that success and other people are not allowed to be part of that success. If that starts, then you won't go this far. If you're able to open up and make sure that everybody gets to be part of something, you will be able to go extremely far. And I think Copenhagen, Noma, what has happened in the last 15 years for a whole region is a very good example of that, of collaboration.
And an example that we should learn from here in Lebanon, because as individuals we are good, sometimes very good, but when it comes to team working and to bonding together and looking in the same direction, there's a problem.
But it's horrible to collaborate. It's the worst thing in the world. It's the most difficult thing in the world to collaborate, because you have to give a little bit away in a way, and if you feel like you know exactly the way to go, it can be hard.
Someone has to have the final cut.
No. No.
No?
No.
Okay, no.
That's my opinion.
No, I mean, if we're working as a team, the 5 of us, and we're working on a chicken, and someone has to decide if the chicken is going to the client or not. No? Or do we vote?
I mean, I've been here in Lebanon for a few days, and all the time I hear, when I ask about what's the story in Lebanon, people say, yes, yes, but. Yes, yes, but. Why is the problem in the south? Yeah, that's because but. You know? To your question, I would say, you're kind of right.
But.
This guy is Lebanese after 3 days. And speaking of Danish people turning into Lebanese, God's know here, and my colleagues at Lorient know how I bring a lot of problems to Lorient since I'm at Lorient 20 years ago with politicians and ambassadors. I have just one thing to say. The person sitting here is not one of the most efficient foreign ambassador in Lebanon. It's math. It's only